What's up, guys? Welcome to the session. This is going to be float betting flop population analysis module. Let's bring up the range research data. We're just going to get a general feel for how much the player pool is folding, and we'll break that down by a few different variables as well. So we'll start with single raised heads up pots. So we can see in the top right there, the versus flop float value, 46%. Let's first of all break that down by bet sizing. Now, what we can see is consistent auto profit across pretty much every bet sizing range. So if we have a look at half pot, we have 45% success frequency. Remember, break-even threshold there will be about 33%. Against 1/3, break-even thresholds 25, we're succeeding at 36% frequency. Even the 2/3 sizing, with 40% break-even threshold, we have 54% fold equity. So it doesn't matter too much the bet sizing we use, we generate automatic profit. Now, when we compare these values to GTO values, one of the trends we see across the entire game tree is a tendency for the player pool to overfold against small sizings, but defend at roughly the right frequency against the larger sizings, or at least closer to the right frequency. So what this means is we are incentivized to use smaller sizings with hands that really don't have a lot of equity. So if we completely miss the flop and we want to float bet the flop with an air type hand without really too much prospects for improving, 1/3 sizing is usually going to be our go-to sizing in this situation. But as we can see, regardless of the sizing, we generate automatic profit here. Now, in terms of what to do if we get called, we can see the average data for how the population responds to a double barrel after they call a flop float bet. We have 39% fold equity, and then we have 44% fold equity on the river triple barrel. So let's break those down by some additional information. So 39%, well, let's look at that by sizing. So if we look at half pot, for example, 37%, and it's good to keep in mind that there's usually some card removal effects here. So remember, those folding frequencies are derived from the average folding frequency, regardless of the hand we have. So of course, sometimes, and when I say we, I mean hero playing against the population. So here is some of the time going to have the stone cold nuts. And what that means is it's going to have an impact on villain's folding frequency, because when hero has the stone cold nuts, it basically means it's harder for villain to defend because some of the good cards are in hero's hand. So what essentially happens is when we have a very good hand, the population is going to fold slightly more. When we have a slightly more speculative bluff, the population is going to be defending slightly more often. So keep in mind, the absolute weakest hands in our range won't succeed at this frequency. So when we have something like 37% fold equity when firing a half pot bet, keep in mind that if we did have a complete air ball, it's not really going to work 37% of the time. It's going to work a lot closer to the break-even threshold, which is 33% in this case. So we need to factor in an additional, at least 2 or 3% for card removal effects on the turn. So what this means is, although we could technically go around airballing the turn every single time we float bet the flop, it's probably not going to be the best line. So of course, one of the lines which you won't look at in detail right now is the float bet stop and go line. And that's going to be very profitable. So if we do float bet the flop with air, we still have air on the turn. The data here doesn't really indicate that we should be double barreling, but we can, of course, go ahead and SNG the river. Now, of course, we should still barrel the turn if we have the right type of equity. So really, this is going to be a gut shot or better, or it's going to be a vulnerable pair that needs protecting. It can sometimes be worth checking out the turn texture as well. So you can see the average folding frequency here is 39. But if it's a very dry board or an overcard turn, we get a spike in fold equity. 4 straight, 43%. four flushes, that's kind of an interesting data point that almost implies that we should just automatically fire on a full flush turn after float betting the flop. So that could well be the right thing to do here, because 48% is obviously a lot of fold equity. Four straight is fairly good. Flush completes. The interesting thing here is because we are the cold caller, it's a float bet situation, we generally like it when there's coordination on the turn card. It's good for us as the cold caller. But aside from that, four flushes turn where we could probably fire any two, we really want to have an equity-driven firing range in the turn. Having said that, if we do get past the flop and the turn, the fold equity against the river triple looks fairly good. Not great, but enough that we should be firing a triple barrel by default. So for example, the 2/3 sizing, which we typically use on the river, has 45%. The break-even threshold's around about 40. So it's a marginally plus EV river triple in the situation, assuming we fire flop and turn. And it's not great, but this is where some of the other metrics might grab our attention, which is the board run out. So for example, if it's an overcard river, in this situation, we have 47% fold equity and should pull the trigger on a triple barrel. And once again, we see things a little bit inverted here in the sense that, you know, we get used to the idea that we want draws to brick on the river. And generally that is true when we're the PFR, but it's not always true when we're the cold caller. So notice here in this situation, when the flush completes, we actually generate more fold equity. So flush completes 47% fold equity on the triple, but flush bricks 43% fold equity on the triple, which is actually below average, right? We've got 44% average fold equity on the triple here, you know, the float bet triple barrel. But assuming the flush bricks, now we only get 43% fold equity on the triple. Assuming the river pairs, this looks like directly minus EV. And, you know, we have a fairly large database here. This is our 40 million database. It is, of course, possible to do range research with more hands. But, you know, when it says river pairs 40%, that's probably a fairly reliable metric that, you know, if we do float bet the flop and the river pairs, we don't really need to pull the trigger on the triple barrel. That's not good for us. You got to kind of think of this as, you know, opponent is in bluff catching mode. You know, he's decided to take a line where he's not c-bet the flop OP. He's played check call flop. He's played check call turn. You know, we really kind of get the impression of some kind of mid-range bluff catcher. So if you think about that from opponent's perspective, he likes it when draws brick, right? You know, he's there with his second pair or weak top pair, or whatever it is, and he's thinking, I hope that flush draw bricks, because when that flush draw bricks, I can now quite easily cool down the triple barrel. At the very least, it should just give you a good way of remembering what kind of textures we want to see here. So imagine our opponent bluff catching against the float bet triple. What's another thing he doesn't want to see? He doesn't want to see an overcard, right? Because if there's an overcard, it means his mid pair bluff catcher or his top pair weak kicker bluff catcher is less likely to be good on an overcard river. You know, the ironic thing is that maybe we're more likely to be bluffing if we continue to fire on an overcard river. But the point is, we get that spike in fold equity. Our opponent doesn't want to see that card because it decreases the absolute strength of his hand. So one of the reasons why river pairs is going to be good for our opponent is because, once again, it doesn't threaten our opponent's bluff catching region. You know, if the board pairs, it basically just means there wasn't another high card out there, right? The other thing is, if our opponent does have this, you know, fairly capped mid-range bluff catching range, then sometimes when the river pairs, it's actually just going to give our opponent trips. And the reason why this is important is because, as you can see, there's over a 10% range here in terms of fold equity for that river triple barrel there after we float bet the flop. Because on the one hand, we have river pairs, which is one of our worst, aside from double pairs, which is the absolute worst. That's 37%, right? 40% on the river pairs, though. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have four flushes and four straights with 51% fold equity on the triple barrel. So once again, if we follow that analogy through, for opponent having this mid-range bluff catcher, does he want a full flush run out? No, he doesn't, because now his bluff catcher is probably not going to be good. Does he want a four straight run out? No, he doesn't. And look, those are some of the points where we get the most fold equity, right? 51% on the full flush, 51% on the four straight. So as you can imagine, that would be a fairly big error for us if, we did float bet the flop, we did second barrel the turn, then a four flush or four straight gets there in the river and we get spooked by the river card. And we say something like, well, I would have triple barrel bluffed, but now there's a four to straight out there. I'm not going to pull the trigger on that. That would clearly be a mistake, right? Because according to the data, that's one of the best river cards for us. So with that analogy in your mind, if you imagine as soon as your opponent is check calling against that flop float bet, he has something in that middling region, it really gives context for understanding why we get increased fold equity on certain types of rivers, but decreased on others. And it helps to explain why when the flush bricks in this situation, we actually get less fold equity. Because, our opponent is probably not chasing a draw as much in the spot. He's more likely to be chasing a draw if he was the cold caller pre-flop facing our aggression. That's why we like it when the draws brick when we're the aggressor, when we're the PFR. But here, there's a chance that players just go ahead and c-bet if they have a draw, right? So, check call against flop float is a very specific line. When we understand, what kind of hands populate that, it helps us to understand the nuances of the textual run out here as well. Now, with that instead, let's just have a very quick look at the check calling range against the flop float bet. See if we see some evidence of that. I'll just give hands to note a minute here. Right, check call against flop float bet. Let's have a look. So you can see there is pretty much a spike in the range distribution there in that mid pair region, right? Mid pair to top pair weak kicker to, sometimes top pair good kicker. Sometimes even things like over pair, which is, you might imagine that's kind of unusual. I don't think it's the rule. It's more of the exception. There is a surprising amount of trash. I wouldn't be surprised if this gets generated by, someone who is planning to check fold, but then there's a very small float bet. Like if you look down the list here, there's some very small float bets going on. So these hands end up being check called instead. So I guess there is some air in the range here as well. But I think, a lot of the time, it's going to end up being more speculative backdoor equity type hands rather than direct draws. Although, as you can see, there are some direct draws in the check calling range. So, it's not impossible on a draw completing river that villain doesn't have the draw. Like he could have the draw as well. It's possible. But as an overall metric, we're really thinking about that mid pair type bluff catching region. Okay, so we've got our overall average metric there for versus flop float of 46%. It's fairly high, to be honest, and keep in mind this is a fairly modern database as well at the time of making this video. So if anything, it seems like flop floats are succeeding more than they used to. 46% fold equity across every bet sizing range. Let's have a look if we can break this down by some additional variables. Let's have a look at texture, for example. So just keep in mind, average is 46. Let's just run through the different board textures here and see what we find. So code red, we actually get slightly less fold equity on a code red. Dynamic, 46, so about average. Semi-dry, 46. Dry, we actually get slightly less. Monotone, 53. So monotone boards, they really do just exist in their own universe where it almost doesn't matter what the situation is. Everyone just always seems to overfold monotone boards. To other types of textures, there's an exception, right? You can have a certain board where villain folds too much, but then in another context, that same board, the pool doesn't fold enough, for example, whereas monotone doesn't seem to matter what the situation is. We just get a spike in fold equity on monotone textures. So you can see float bet flop mono, we are just printing money with 53% fold equity. If we break that down by sizing, half pot bet, generating folds 53% of the time when the break-even threshold is 33. It's completely ridiculous, really, in terms of just clicking a button and printing some money there. Paired dynamic. Now, one thing I'd like you to notice is as soon as the board is paired, we get a sudden dip in full equity on the float bet. And I think if you analyze this maybe for a different pool, usually paired dry is worse. You can confirm this if you want to. This is what I would expect to see anyway. Like paired dynamic looks weirdly low, and then paired dry might be roughly where it should be, or maybe paired dry is running on the high side and paired dynamic on the low side over this data set. But the point is, paired boards are bad. We're not going to get as much full equity. And there are certain types of situation where I really wouldn't worry too much about float betting trash. So, paired dry board with a high card. If you want to avoid those situations, it's okay. Having said that, we still generate automatic profit. I mean, if you look at something like paired dry, half pot, 42% full equity, that's still a lot. So you really can't go too wrong here, just float betting very aggressively. It's not really a case of your float bet ever becoming minus EV. It just is more of a question of, is it possible that the delayed float bet is going to generate a higher expectation on certain specific boards where we don't generate a lot of full equity as the float better? For example, look at this versus delayed float. You can see 53% full equity. So it's definitely a highly folded line. So we want to keep that in the back of our mind. Are we going for the direct float bet or the delayed float bet? Certain types of very bad textures, you might prefer to go for the delayed, but you can see these numbers are still fairly high. Ace high, 45 fold to float bets. That's 1% below average. 46 on king high, so that's average. Queen jack high, average. 10-9 high, slightly below average, and low, slightly above average for the low board textures. There doesn't appear to be a big difference there. But, as a rough guide, we don't really like the ace and king high boards, at least in theory. You can see it's not a big difference in terms of the actual data points here, but at least in theory, we don't like ace and king high boards. We don't like dry boards as much, and we don't like paired boards. So although the impact individually for each of those variables is not too significant, if we stack those variables and we have, for example, a paired dry board with a high card, we could definitely end up with less than 40% full equity at this particular decision node. You imagine something like an ace deuce or an ace deuce deuce or a king deuce deuce or king 5-5, something like that. Feel free to skip your float bet in the spot. But aside from that, this is really just a spot where we want to attack very aggressively with air. We want to attack very aggressively with draws. We still want to bet our value hands. Checking range is really going to be a lot of non-vulnerable pairs. Dominated draws are going to be fairly good for check back here as well. And also make sure you check back a decent number of top pairs in the spot as well. They're not worth 3 streets usually, unless they have a very good kicker. They're not worth 3 streets, and they make really good bluff catches for facing our opponent's delayed c-bet and follow-up line. So especially against regs, it's great to have some of those top pairs in our checking back range, and then we can just mostly close our eyes, cool turn, cool river in that situation. Okay, let's have a look at impact of formation. Now, honestly, flop float bets, most of the time it's going to be the big blind versus small blind situation. Just so you can see that specifically for big blind versus small blind, the pool is actually falling 1% above the average. So average 46, pool's falling 47 in BB versus SB. Cutoff versus button, again, above average. So 2 late position formations, slightly above average. When we look at an early position formation like button float bet versus hijack or button float bet versus low jack, we see a dip in fold equity because this is now early position formation. So we can see button versus hijack drops to 45% fold equity. Button versus low jack drops to 43%. Hijack versus cutoff, 45. Low jack versus cutoff, 43. Low jack versus hijack, 43. So just keep that in mind. Just a slight adjustment to our overall outlook. If it's a late position formation, float bets are going to be slightly better. They're going to succeed more often. If it's an early position formation, we are going to get less full equity in those situations. Okay, let's have a look now at 3-bet pots. Just in terms of profile, by the way, we won't explicitly look at different profiles in this session, but you're going to see what you typically see in other parts of the game tree. which is your float bets are usually going to work slightly more often against regs and slightly less often against fish profiles. So fairly typical. We can still float bet against fish profiles unless they are, of course, cooling station, but float bet against volatile fish, no problem. You know, our pink tag, no problem. Just keep in mind it's going to work a few percent less. So you want to factor in other variables as well. Although formation is not usually one of them, because the pink tags, they don't really care about formation that much. They just play the same. It's actually more the regs who care more about formation and are going to be folding less in early position battles, etc. But just keep that in mind as one of your additional variables that may stack in a given situation to lean your decision in one direction or the other. The fish are going to fold a couple of percent less than average. The regs are going to fold a couple of percent more than the average pool tendencies. Okay, let's have a look now at 3-bet pots. So this is a little bit less of a good area out of the gate. So we can see single raise heads up pots look really good. 3-bet pots. So most common iteration of this is button versus blinds, perhaps. So we've open raised the button, blinds have 3-bet us. Now, pool c-bets a lot, right? These days, you can see pool c-bet 71%. You know, in fact, this is like part of the game tree where average players c-betting more aggressively than solver. So c-bet frequencies are higher than solver in 3-bet pots. In fact, most areas of the game tree, including single raised, c-bet frequencies are higher than solver. It's just something that players are doing too much of relative to what GTO says. This is no exception. 71% flop c-bet. It shouldn't quite be that high. Obviously, it's trending at the moment to c-bet hyper aggressively in 3-bet pots. So we don't necessarily get the opportunity to float bet a lot, but we will get the opportunity 29% of the time, according to the data here, to float bet the flop in a 3-bet pot. Question is, should we take that situation if it comes up? Let's start by breaking the data down by sizing once again. And what we see is a little bit of a different picture where things just don't look great in terms of a bluff spot for us. So start with 2/3, break-even threshold 40%, population folding frequency 46%. Half pot float bet, break-even threshold 33, pool folding frequency 37. So, you know, we're kind of seeing values like 4% above the auto profit threshold. Again, remember, there's that whole card removal aspect to this where the folding frequency we get on average is not the folding frequency we'll get with the weakest hands in our range, because the stronger hands in our range will get folds more often due to card removal effects. So we have to assume that our fold equity is going to be a few percent lower with our more speculative holdings like backdoor equity or, you know, some kind of pure trash type hand. Although keep in mind, and this is just something that's specific to, well, it's specific to poker in general, so not that specific, but especially for 3-bet pots, overcards are a form of equity. Like there's a difference in 3-bet pots between having 2 overcards, 1 overcard, and 0 overcards. It will impact on how aggressively we're supposed to bet. Overcards are good because they give us opportunity to make a higher top pair on the later streets. So just keep that in mind. It's not all about backdoor flush, backdoor straight type equity when deciding whether or not to float bet. Sometimes 2 good overcards could be the difference between deciding whether to float bet or to check. It is a form of equity. But what we can see is the low equity hands are not really incentivized to bet. And again, they're not necessarily going to be directly losing. I mean, if we assume that a half pot bet with complete trash, you know, let's just pretend we've lost our cards beneath the table somewhere. We don't have any cards. We are probably going to be generating, what, 34% full equity, maybe 33 if we're a bit pessimistic. That's the exact break-even point of a half pot bet. In other words, we're not losing money with a half pot bet. We're just not making any money either. And the problem really is that the delayed float bet is going to generate a clearly positive expectation. So versus delayed float, it doesn't look that great actually either at 44%, you know, compared to some of our delayed lines, which succeed above 50. But the point is, this is now clearly profitable expectation for us. So it's usually better to take this than to take a, you know, potentially break even float bet on the flop. You can see the delayed float half pot bet working 44%, which is a good 11% above the break-even threshold. So that's why we don't want to fire complete trash with the flop float bet. want some kind of equity. But like I say, just keep in mind, 2 overcards is equity in a 3-bet pot. That can sometimes be all you need. And, if your equity is marginal, if it is kind of in the form of just 2 overcards, I mean, keep in mind, most likely good hand we're going to make by the river is going to be top pair, right? Assuming we're not hitting runner on a trips or runner on a 2-pair, it's going to be a top pair type hand. That doesn't really want to play a large pot. So natural sizing selection here with those kind of very marginal hands is going to be in that 1/3 region, which, doesn't look great. 25% is a break-even threshold there for that. So it's really purely that equity that's going to make it worthwhile even firing in that situation. Okay, so, if you don't want to fire those, at the very least, we need some kind of good back to equity type hand. Having said that, the thing that's really going to make or break this now is going to be the texture. And you'll see that there's actually a range of different results we get depending on texture. Let's just make sure we're having that average value in mind, 35% full equity on the float bet. Let's just jump straight to ace high texture. Look at that full equity. You see that full equity just dropped from 35 to 27. Now, some of the other variables we're looking at in single raise pots, they barely moved the needle, right? We're seeing like change of 1%, 2% based on formation, stuff like that. This is a change of 8%. So average is 35. Falling frequency specifically on an ace high texture is 27%. In other words, this just went from a break-even float bet to complete garbage float bet, right? Half pot bet works 29%. If we have trash, it's going to work less than 29% due to card removal effects, right? It's going to work like 26%. That's a great way just to, throw a bet out into the void, never to be seen again. So really big difference there. So we're going to need considerable equity to float bet on an ace high. It doesn't really seem worth it with a lot of different types of hands that we can have. So, ideally, we're going to need some kind of direct draw or maybe a pair or something. I think just having backdoor equity is not going to cut it in this situation. The explanation might be fairly straightforward. I mean, what does it typically mean when someone 3-bets pre-flop and then checks an ace high flop? What's like the typical explanation for that? Well, they have kings, queens, or jacks, right? They 3-bet a big pair pre-flop. If they had ace king, they would have c-bet. The other explanation is they decided to slow play their ace king, right? They 3-bet their ace king pre and decided to slow play the flop. That's even worse for us. Sometimes it might be they 3-bet something like suited ace pre-flop and they catch an ace on the flop and they decide it's not worth 3 streets, so they decide to check. But really thinking about it, there is no situation where an ace high flop is really that good for us. In fact, even if we flop an ace, it's still not really that good for us because, either our opponent has better ace or he has something like pocket jacks and, may not be paying us off several streets potentially. And, if that sounds like an excuse to start launching a big bluff, it's really not in a lot of cases because, that's not really what we should be trying to do, force our opponent to, fold a top pair weak kicker or something because they just may or may not do that. We can't even guarantee they're going to fold something like kings in the spot. I mean, just look at that full equity across 3 streets for this scenario on the ace high board. 27 flop, 34 turn, 32 versus river triple. These are garbage falling frequencies, right? And then let's have a look at the calling range here on the river. Just to kind of guess like average, minimum required hand strength for a value bet in the float bet triple line in a 3-bet pot and an ace high board. So we want to add up to 50% here because it's a value bet. And, remember, this doesn't even factor in raises. So even 50% is, kind of an optimistic estimate. So we've got 44, 45, top pair second kicker. So at a stretch, like in a really good spot, you might get 3 streets with top pair second kicker. But, if we're conservative about this, it needs to be top pair top kicker basically to float bet triple barrel. So you can see it's not like we can bet super wide for value. It's not like our opponents are being really sticky here against triple barrel. They're just legitimately strong a lot of the time. Yeah, once again, they kind of have that bluff catching region a lot, right? You can probably apply some of the same logic here to playing 3-bet pots that we did earlier to single raise pots. I mean, look at this post-flop diagram for check call against flop float in 3-bet pots. What is like the number one hand in that diagram when someone decides to check call after 3-betting pre-flop? OOP. Mid-pocket pair, right? And, what are the chances if we bring out the pop-up? There's a whole bunch of like jacks, kings, queens, stuff like that, right? It's almost transparent the way that the pool is playing when they check on an ace-high texture instead of fire continuation bet. What's the second most common type of hand there? It's a top pair weak kicker, top pair good kicker. And of course, we get some slow plays. So this is our opponent with top trips, top set. Decides that due to the blocker effects, it's better for him to play a check line and trap rather than fire a direct c-bet. That's what we see going on here. It starts to become fairly obvious why this is not a spot we want to attack. So let's check out some of the other textures. King high is slightly better for us, but just remember that average, right? Average 35, king high 30, well below average. Same kind of things here. Like opponent's going to have decent amount of kings in their range, which made a top pair weak kicker with a king, or they're going to have things like queens and jacks on king high board. This is not a spot we want to be attacking. It does look like our prospects return and river barrel improves slightly. We now get 40% fold equity on the river triple as opposed to 32. So that might sometimes come in handy, but king high is pretty bad as well. Queen jack high, it's kind of like average, right? If there's a queen or a jack out there, you are in average folding frequency territory, which is still really not very good for 3-bet pots. Having said that, keep in mind that there's probably a difference between a queen and a jack. This is both queen and jack high boards we're considering here. A jack high board, we probably get above average fold equity. Now, probably queen high is below average fold equity. Jack high is probably above average fold equity. 10-9 high, look at that, right? 4% above the average on a 10 and 9 high board. And we're almost in the territory where we're thinking, you know what? This starts to look like a pretty good bluff spot for us now. It's not great, but it's enough where we're thinking about potentially firing any two cards in the spot. So we've got 60 to 80% pot, 50%. So that's 10% above the auto profit threshold. Maybe 6 or 7 if we factor in pessimistic amounts of card removal effects. 50% sizing, 41% full equity, break-even threshold, 33 there on that. And 1/3. So that's 25%. It does look like on face value, and I don't really like to guess at these numbers without running an EV calculation. Besides, we can't really run a vacuum EV calculation on the flop anyway. That has its own pitfalls. But can't help noticing that, 1/3 is only 5% above the auto profit threshold, whereas half pot is 8% above the auto profit threshold, and 2/3 sizing is 10% above the automatic profit threshold. So is there a logical argument for suggesting that, we could use slightly larger sizings here? It's possible, but, this is also like another area we don't want to get into too much because at the end of the day, we just don't know. Yes, it looks like these sizings generate slightly more fold equity in a vacuum, but they violate some of our other fundamental principles as well, which is that now we're investing larger bet sizings on average with our trash type holdings. That then has an impact on the fold equity we get on the later streets, which technically decreases the EV of the flop situation, right? You can't calculate flop EV in a vacuum. And, certainly I remember with the, we're talking about like flop c-bet in the early days of the academy, and we saw this same kind of thing with like 80% c-bet sizings. And even though it was just an observation, it generated a decent amount of confusion where there's still players that took away from that we should be betting 90% pot with our air hands on the flop. Whereas we don't really know that without a full EV calculation, and that's too complex. So just understand that it's just an observation, right? It's interesting how the larger sizing seems to work more. We are not suggesting that you should necessarily use a large sizing with trash. It's just purely an observation because there are other problems with that. Small sizing, doesn't seem to be as good directly on the flop, but we do notice if we use smaller sizings on the flop, we get more fold equity on the turn barrel, we get more fold equity on the river, and the turn and river play need to be factored into the EV calculation as well. Main takeaway right now is just that shift in fold equity based on the board texture. Clearly, our float bet strategy needs to be heavily based around the type of board texture. And low is the best. Look at that, low. So keep in mind, low is 8 high or lower, 42% fold equity on the float bet. So that's starting to look, really healthy for us now. So what immediately looked like a kind of murky average of 35%, we can see is actually a collection of some really bad float bet spots, like ace high boards, 27% fold equity at the extreme one end of the spectrum, and then 15% higher at the other end of the spectrum when we have 42% fold equity on those low textures. So the basic level standard lines that we have is we don't float bet trash in 3-bet pots. But as you can see, it's possible to refine that by taking into account textural variables. And really a slightly more accurate, better approach would be to say something like, probably if it's jack high or lower, maybe we have a float bet range by default, or maybe 10 high and lower. But if it's queen high and above, that's danger territory for firing a float bet. The problem we have there is that the range of the checker, the player that skipped their c-bet OOP in a 3-bet pot, their range is too strong on boards with a queen, king, and an ace. It's going to be a whole bunch of mid pairs, like weak top pairs, slow plays where villain's worried about the card removal effects of his top set, stuff like that. Whereas, think about this the other way around. What does it suggest to us when someone 3-bets pre-flop and then they check on an 8-4 deuce board? What kind of hand is that? Is it aces? Well, it might be, but most players c-bet their aces there, right? Most players c-bet their aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, probably even nines in that spot because they have an overpair, right? That's a logical thing to do. They don't have top set on an 8-high board, probably. So what do they have? What's the most likely hand that they have? It's a 2-over card type hand, right? Something like ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack that they didn't want to fire a continuation bet with. Or it's, one of the more speculative hands that ends up in the big blind 3-bet range. Just so you know, one of the things that big blind does that small blind isn't supposed to do as much is big blind will shop with a few suited connectors. So, big blind's going to shop with stuff like 6-7, 7-8, 8-9, 9-10. Whereas, 6-7 suited, it's not a great small blind 3-bet generally. So big blind is a little bit wider with those types of speculative hands in the 3-bet range. So basically, it could be something that's completely missed the flop, like, suited ace or a suited connector, something like that, that's just giving up. Or it could be a high card type hand. Might be planning on playing check call, right? That's something that players could do, is they could, 3-bet an ace king and then try and play check call and an 8-4 deuce. Probably not the best line. Probably better to c-bet anyway. Let's just have a look at that check calling range specifically on the low texture. So we actually see 2 spikes in that calling distribution, right? And, one of those spikes is not mid-pair type hands anymore. In fact, this is actually really kind of polarized looking, right? You've got mostly trash. And if we assume backdoor flush is trash as well, I mean, most of these hands are pretty trashy, right? It's like overcards that just so happen to have a backdoor flush. That's 47%. That's like 50% of the check calling range on a low board is actually just some kind of ace high type hand with maybe backdoor equity. Then what's the other spike here? It's the overpair region. So you can see players do trap their overpairs. Like, it does happen. It's just not like the most likely hand we'd give someone. They 3-bet pre-flop. It's a 4-3-3. They check. Probably not going to immediately think, hey, this guy's got pocket kings. He checked a 4-3-3. That's not what we're going to think, right? We're going to assume he's going to c-bet that. But, having said that, I think this particular part of the range distribution is high enough that it's probably counterintuitive, in the sense that for whatever reason, players will check call trap a decent number of overpairs on the lower textures. It's still most likely they just have 2 overcards. That's like the most likely thing. That's like at least half of the range. Let's see if it's similar on the 10-9 high board as well. Let's just have a look at that check calling range against the float bet there. Same kind of thing, right? There's 2 distinct spikes in that range distribution. There's trash, and you can kind of lump the backdoor flush hands with that. It's like 41% now, 42%, and then overpair. And sometimes, it's tempting just to bring these up because it's almost like hard to imagine that players do this, but they do with a frequency that's probably higher than we'd expect. That's why I'd say it's counterintuitive. I mean, opponent 3-bets us, they check on the 10-8-4. Are we giving them credit for pocket aces? No, that's not really the first hand that comes to our head, right? Okay, this guy checked on the 10-8-4. He must have aces. Not really. Checked on the 10-deuce-3. He must have pocket aces. We can almost understand like kings checking on the 7-9-8 because, that might even be checked GTO with a fairly high frequency just because of how bad the board is. But there's this counterintuitive aspect to some of the check calls. Having said that, the check calling range is obviously fundamentally quite weak in this spot. Is it worth triple barreling though? That's like an important question to answer. So we saw for single raise heads up pots, we should be pulling the trigger on the river bet. What about 3-bet pots? Overall, we've got 41. This doesn't look good, all right? It doesn't look great. Again, factoring in card removal, probably not going to be quite worth it. But the thing is, we've got this textual information here as well. And we have very similar considerations here to what we saw for single raise heads up pots. I mean, let's just have a look at this. So keep in mind, average is 41, overcard 46 full equity, non-overcard 41, flush completes 46. Okay, so this is the inverse again of our usual pattern. Usually we get more full equity on flush bricks. With a cold caller here, our opponent's check calling range is like very bluff catch heavy, right? It's a lot of one pair type stuff, even in this situation, okay? Especially on those ace high, king high, queen high boards, which we're not going to be attacking so much anyway. But that's why when the flush completes, this is good for our fold equity here in the spot. Our flush bricks, not so good. River pairs, not so good. Same pattern here, right? It's almost like we're looking at the same run out distribution here for single raised pots, right? 4 flushes, 51, 4 straights, 49, double pairs, 32. So we see very, very good targets for triple barrel bluff on select rivers. So this particular aspect of our game is probably going to be somewhat run out dependent. I'm not sure if there's a specific situation where we should just empty the clip regardless. Let's just check out some of these other types of board distribution as well. So just keep in mind average 35 fold flop. And we saw low boards was 42. So code red 40, dynamic 35, semi-dry 32, dry 27, paired dynamic and paired dry. So this is what I was talking about in terms of the pattern of paired dynamic versus paired dry. Paired dry is usually worse than paired dynamic. So we can see that in the 3-bet pot part of the population analysis here. Paired dynamic, 31%, paired dry, 27% fold equity in this situation. So we can see 2 cross tendencies here. And, those tendencies kind of like stack on top of each other. So the 2 tendencies are the higher the high card, the smaller the amount of fold equity we get with a float bet. But the second aspect to this with those top board textures is that mid-range coordination. So dry boards are especially bad for float bets. Stuff with a bunch of mid-range coordination, like 9-8-7 two-tone, they're going to result in a spike in our fold equity because, it's very difficult for an opponent to, check call his ace king on a 9-8-7 two-tone, whereas he's probably not going to fold his ace king on a 9-deuce-deuce two-tone against our float bet. Okay, so I just want to check out some of the latest stats as well. I just get a feel for the triple barrel. As you can see, code red board. You can see we get quite a lot of full equity on the river there. Whereas if we take a dry board, that also carries on to the river. I mean, one aspect of this, I guess, if we have a code red board, it's probably slightly more likely to be a full flush or 4 straight by the river, that kind of thing. I mean, in terms of a really general picture here, you can see the more mid-range coordination with a low card on the board that's not a queen, king, or an ace, the more full equity we get throughout the entire hands, like whether it's on the turn, it's on the river. So we get some fairly high falling frequencies, but we also get some fairly low falling frequencies. Monotone, once again, just overfolded for no apparent reason. Okay, let's have a look at the positional. Now, as mentioned, in terms of the formation, most common spot is going to be big blind versus button. And it does appear with this data set that the falling frequency is slightly below average here at 34%. So that's 1% below. Let's check out some of the other spots. So if we move back one stage, so we're now in the cutoff against big blind, 32% fold equity on the flop float. Big blind versus hijack, 30%. So there's a really clear trend here. Big blind versus low jack. We couldn't have set that up any more cleanly if we'd engineered it ourselves, right? This is real data, by the way, I assure you. Big blind versus button, 34. Big blind versus cutoff, 32, 30, 28. It goes down by 2% each position we move back. Now, another question which, is pretty good to think about, sometimes just overlooked, and that is what if the 3-better is in the small blind? Because, very often we're playing on the button against a 3-bet. Often we just assume it's all the same, right? It doesn't matter if big blind 3-bets or small blind 3-bets. The truth is that, small blind and big blind ranges are fairly different. 3-betting ranges and the cold calling ranges from those positions are very different from a GTO perspective. They're also very different from a player pool perspective. So what that means is we sometimes run into different falling frequencies. So let's see if that's true here. Big blind versus button, we have 34% fold versus flop float, 1% below average. Button versus small blind, 39%. All right, we've just suddenly jumped up by 5% because our opponent is in the small blind rather than the big blind. Small blind versus cutoff, 37. Small blind versus hijack, 34. Small blind versus low jack, 33. Okay, so small blind versus low jack is kind of similar to big blind versus button, right? We're seeing another really, really clear pattern, and it's something that probably flies below the radar of most players' thought process when deciding whether to float bet in a 3-bet pot. Small blind 3-betters are folding way more often to float bets than big blind 3-betters. That's like a really interesting data point. Partly to do with the difference in range distribution. It's kind of ironic, really, because when we look at a theoretically correct big blind 3-bet range versus a button open and a theoretically correct small blind 3-bet against a button open, most players would say that the small blind 3-bet range is definitely stronger than the big blind 3-bet range. Big blind actually has quite a number of speculative type stuff, like suited aces, suited kings, suited queens, even some suited jacks and offsuit aces in a big blind versus button open GTO range. Whereas, small blind against button is a lot more linear when you look at it. It's kind of like pocket pairs and, suited broadways and some of the good offsuit broadways, suited aces, stuff like that, right? It's much more orderly and organized. Despite that, and, the pool could be doing something completely different. Despite that, small blind's folding a lot more to float bets. So you can see when we look at big blind versus button, it might seem strange to get 34% fold versus float bet, right? Because the overall is 35. So how can we take a late position formation and it's actually 1% lower than the average fold to float bet frequency? That's because the overall is including both playing against the small blind and playing against the big blind. Whereas this value is actually an average of fairly high fold to float bet frequencies when playing against a small blind compared to much lower fold to float bet frequencies when playing against the small blind, when playing against the big blind even. So just out of curiosity, let's just break some of these small blind variables down. So this is like the ideal situation in terms of like, what is the best spot you could be in? Keeping in mind, this is already not a great situation. What is the best flop float bet situation you could be in a 3-bet pot as the caller pre-flop? And it's going to be button versus small blind, right? Open the button, small blind 3-bets. So let's analyze the best situation and figure out whether we can actually fire trash in the spot. And answer appears to be yes, but of course, we have to break that down by board texture, right? We've seen that board texture just makes a huge difference when playing in 3-bet pots. So although we could just naively look at the overall data and say, yeah, you should float bet trash when playing against a small blind in a 3-bet pot, we know enough to know that we have to break that down by sizing. So looking at ace high, it drops to 29%. So regardless of whether villain is in the small blind or big blind, we see a huge decrease in full equity based on the texture. So at what point does it start to become clearly profitable to bet any 2 cards? Well, it might be on a slightly higher texture than, the corresponding versus big blind situation. Who knows? We might get away with float betting trash on a queen high texture now. Against a small blind 3-better, well, even though we'd never do that against a big blind 3-better. But as you can see, like jack high is probably almost definitely profitable. 10-9 high is now just printing money, a 41% fold equity. And low is just free money, right? Almost half the time you're going to pick up that pot there on average when you fire the float bet. So still want to take into account those board textures. They are very important. But as you can see, we can just play more aggressively generally against a small blind 3-better in a flop float bet situation. Let's just finally conclude by having a look at the fold to triple in that specific formation, right? Small blind versus button. And, we get very similar patterns, right? We should be familiar with the pattern. If anything, these numbers seem slightly more spread out. It seems to be a larger range. I might just be imagining things here, but we are ranging from 39 all the way up to 55 in this spot. It's like a 16% range on these values. But we hopefully have this pattern more or less memorized at this stage now. We've looked at it several times in the session. Overcard 49, which is insane, right? Non-overcard 40. Flush completes is now good for us. This is like the inverse of what we're used to. What we're playing as the caller now, the pre-flop caller. Flush bricks. I mean, there's like a huge difference there between flush bricks and flush completes, right? 8%. River pairs is bad. 4 flushes, amazing. 4 straights, really good. And double pairs is, probably minus EV on the bluff spot here in this situation. All right, that was the whistle stop tour of float bet population data. Hopefully you have a really good solid idea of when you should be float betting in single raised and also 3-bet pots, and also when it's a terrible idea, and also, some idea of how to play on the turn, and then what your thought process should look like in terms of whether to pull a trigger on the triple barrel. Right, if you guys have any questions, let me know in the chat. I didn't see any questions so far, so I'm kind of assuming there's not, but give you guys 30 seconds or so to type any questions if you have them. All right, cool. Then we're going to wrap things up. So thanks very much for your attention, guys. Good luck with the grinds. I'll see you next time.